My name is Evan McLean, and I have the privilege of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Emily Bray. And I've known Emily for a really long time, so you're like the one speaker where I don't have cliff notes because I feel like I actually know your history. So let's test me here. So Emily did her undergraduate work at Duke University, which is where we first met, in psychology there. And then she went on to do her doctoral work at the University of Pennsylvania in psychology, where she studied with giants in the field of animal behavior, Dorothy Cheney, Robert Seyfarth, and James Serpell. After getting her PhD at Penn, Emily moved into a postdoctoral and research scientist position, jointly supported between the University of Arizona and Canine Companions, a large national nonprofit provider of service dogs. And most recently, we are very lucky to have recruited Emily to join the faculty here at the University of Arizona College of Veterinary Medicine, where she directs the Bray Lab, which is an acronym for Behavioral Research Across Years. And from the title of her talk today, I think you'll understand why her research focuses on measuring aspects of dog behavior and cognition across the lifespan. So we're really lucky to have Emily here, and I will hand things over to her.
It's okay. Okay, can everyone hear me? Still online? Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you, Evan, for the awesome introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to share with you all research that I've been working on now for over a decade. Okay, I think I have to use a little. Okay, so this is a little repetitive, but I was going to say, if you don't know me, I'm an assistant professor here at Arizona, and my lab focuses on how dogs think and problem solve, including the various factors that influence those behaviors. And I first started doing research with service dogs with an organization called Canine Companions as an undergraduate, and I was so inspired that I went on to get my PhD in dog psychology. And then, as Evan just mentioned, after graduation, I was lucky enough to start that joint postdoc with the University of Arizona and Canine Companions, but it meant that I lived at our field site out in Santa Rosa, California, which is where their national headquarters are located. And I was there for about 6 years before starting my current position here at UA. And I am so excited for the opportunity to be part of the College of Veterinary Medicine here at UA, where one of our main research goals is really putting strong science behind the human-animal relationship. So along with 3 fantastic colleagues, one of whom you just heard from, our core group leads research on what we like to refer to. Sorry, do you guys hear that echo? No, oh, just me. Okay, cool. So what we like to refer to as both ends of the leash. So applying our expertise in areas of both animal wellness and human wellness. And this is actually really unique to have a group together like this doing this. You know, there's a lot of research groups that focus on one or the other, but it's pretty unique that we get to be under one roof collaborating to advance the science in this area. And our vision really is to conduct groundbreaking research that creates a better world for animals and their people. And to do this, we collaborate with experts and practitioners nationwide. And in terms of collaboration, one of our top partners over the years has been Canine Companions. And our goals really dovetail nicely with the mission of Canine Companions because they enhance the lives of people with disabilities by providing highly trained service dogs free of charge to the recipient. And just to give a bit of background on Canine Companions, they are the largest provider of service dogs in the United States, and they breed, raise, and train dogs to perform specialized tasks for people with disabilities. So before I dive into some of the specifics of what we've been finding, I thought it would be fun to share some of our stats related to Arizona projects that have jointly involved Canine Companions since 2011. Full disclosure, I had to do this for another presentation we gave recently to Canine Companions, but it's kind of fun. So I'm going to take you guys on our journey. So over the past 13 years, we have performed our cognition testing on upwards of 1,500 dogs. Also, thanks to many of you in this room. Thank you. And they have ranged in age from 8 weeks to 13 years and included over 90 graduate teams and studies of how canine companions dogs impact their graduate. And that's work, shout out to Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. O'Hare. And so both of these numbers, excitingly, continue to grow by the day. Excitingly, other people recognize the value of our work as well and have been generous in the support of our joint mission. So we've received almost $14 million in grant funding, and that includes from federal agencies as well as nonprofit foundations that are all interested in improving the lives of people with disabilities as well as the animals who support them. And thus far, our research has resulted in 22 scientific publications that involve canine companions dogs. And it's really important to us that this research is not done in a vacuum. We want to get the findings out there so that other researchers and other assistance dog organizations can really put this knowledge to use in order to maximize the positive impact of the dogs on the humans while also increasing the welfare of the dogs. And to that point, obviously, we're academics. Recording our findings in the scientific literature is important, but we also want to translate our findings and recognize the value of putting them in a form that is both visible and understandable to the average person. So in summary, together, the University of Arizona and Canine Companions are really putting strong science behind the amazing impact that these dogs are having in our society. And I'm really looking forward to summarizing some of our past 10+ years of research for you all today. So for those of you who may not be familiar, I just want to briefly recap the life course of a typical canine companions dog. So all puppies start out within the vicinity of the Santa Rosa campus, either in the private home of a breeder caretaker or at the Professional Canine Early Development Center. From there, they're transported literally all over the country, and then they go to live with their puppy raiser. And this is a really critical period for their socialization. Around 18 months or so, they return to one of the 6 main campuses, and that's when they begin professional training. And ideally, by the time they're about 2 years old, they are going to be placed with a graduate as a service dog. And here's an exciting part. So at the University of Arizona, we have been partnering with Canine Companions to do research at essentially every important stage of this journey. And so here's a quick sneak peek of just a few examples that I'll be sharing during this talk. So we've looked over just the first couple weeks of birth at how interactions with the mother might affect later behavior and outcome of those puppies. We've looked at the behavior of the 8-week-old puppies and the role of genetics in explaining the variation that we do see. We've analyzed the results from thousands of surveys and temperament tests that Canine Companions has been internally curating since the early 2000s, and that is to connect behavior to eventual outcome in the program. And finally, we have followed up with hundreds of puppies by evaluating their behavior again in professional training to help determine the stability of key traits over time. And just to give you a sense of what this research looks like in terms of sample sizes, here's a timeline of all the evaluations that we've been doing kind of at the different ages and life stages. And I'll be returning to this diagram again throughout the talk. But it represents kind of a vast amount of effort and research on the part of a lot of people, which is cool. Okay, last thing before I jump into our findings, I want to briefly touch on why we're doing this research in the first place. And the data that I'm about to present are really valuable because they help us to understand the core psychological processes that are present in dogs, which can then affect how they ultimately do their job. So that's things like impulse control, memory, social cognition is a big one. And we can study how these traits develop in early life, how they change with age, and how they're impacted by genetics and aspects of the environment. And answering this question is also important because it has implications for how we can set dogs and people up for success in their relationships. And this applies broadly, right, to the welfare of all dogs, but also in a very applied sense when it comes to the effectiveness and efficiency of breeding, training, and placing working dogs. So it turns out that the traits that we study can result in very different outcomes for dogs that are living and working with humans in these different capacities. And so in our work with assistance dogs, what we're finding is that not only do these traits have implications for dogs in these various roles, but the implications can be very different. So what makes a good dog or what makes a smart dog can really depend on what we're ultimately asking and expecting of the dog. And when it comes to working dogs specifically, I think we're really hoping to achieve kind of two main goals. So first, we're hoping to facilitate the prediction of which dogs will and will not succeed, preferably as early in their life as possible. And this is going to help ultimately save organizations resources and also maximize impact through more dog placements more quickly. Second, if we can identify the characteristics that are linked to success, we can then work to cultivate them. And that can be both through selectively breeding for those things, but also by fostering them through appropriate rearing, socialization, and training practices. All right, and the better we ultimately understand canine cognition and behavior, the better we can use that knowledge to really maximize the positive impact of dogs on humans, augment the human-animal bond, and increase the welfare of the dogs. Okay, so now we get to the data. So starting at the beginning, across mammals, we know that early interactions with the mother often have really long-term consequences for the development of their offspring. And we see this in terms of stress responses, memory, exploratory tendencies, sociability, anxiety. But I was curious about how the maternal environment affected dog behavior. So as a bit of background, I first started tackling this question in a population of guide dogs from the Seeing Eye. And so in this initial study, I observed 21 mothers and their 138 puppies over those first few weeks of life. So to measure maternal style, basically it involves watching a lot of videos of dogs, and you can quantify the amount of motherly behavior in the dams by coding for the behavior. So just to give you all a visual, here's an example of a dog displaying relatively high levels of maternal behavior. She's licking and grooming. She's in close proximity. She's displaying vigilance behaviors. She's nursing her puppies. She's in contact with her puppies, even when she's not in the pool with them. And this is compared to a dog displaying relatively low levels of maternal behavior. I get it. I'm a mom, right? Sometimes we get a break. But in all seriousness, it's cool because we really do see this wide range in behavior among the dams. So what we ended up doing was summarizing all of our measures of maternal behavior using principal components analysis, and basically found everything was best described by a single component. And so essentially what that means is that mothers who are choosing to spend a lot of time with their puppies are also highly interactive. So they spend lots of time in contact with their puppies, licking and grooming them and nursing them. And we did find that maternal behavior was highly stable within mothers across weeks. We also validated this measure by showing it was associated with two independent measures of maternal style that we didn't use to build the principal component. So specifically an experimental measure and an endocrine one. So mothers who exhibited higher levels of maternal behavior had higher baseline cortisol levels, and they tended to show the largest peak in cortisol after being briefly separated from half of their litter, so a small normal stressor. So now that we have this quantifiable metric of maternal behavior, we can now ask, how is it associated with her offspring behaviors when they reach adolescence? So I did find some links between maternal behavior and offspring behavior. So for example, puppies whose mothers displayed more maternal behaviors were themselves more likely to demonstrate anxious behaviors when they were alone in a room for a couple minutes. And they also were not as skilled at an independent problem-solving task. And our main finding was that puppies exposed to high levels of maternal behavior were less likely to graduate as working guides. So these results might seem counterintuitive. I was surprised when I ran the numbers, but I do think that one plausible interpretation is that low levels of maternal behavior might actually be giving puppies the chance to build independence and resilience in a way that's going to serve them well in their later career as a guide. But it definitely raised the question for me, and many others, how generalizable are these results? So for example, would we find the same results in canine companions population of service dogs? And I'm going to give you all a quick crash course on the differences between guide and service dogs, who both fall under the umbrella of assistance dogs, but do have some key differences. So guide dogs are responsible for guiding their blind handler, and therefore they have to make decisions independently because they are privy to information that is unavailable to their handler. Service dogs, on the other hand, are really dependent on their handler. They need to be extremely attentive and tuned in to whatever it is that their handler is directing them to do at any given moment. So now, turning back to our canine companions data, you can see we're at our first early life data set. So for this study, we enrolled 59 service dog dams. Well, they were not themselves service dogs, but they were in the population. And we observed them mothering their litters, and then we followed up with their offspring down the road, very similar to what we did at the CNI. And so there's a bunch of different questions that we're actively exploring with all of this data, and I'm going to walk you through two of the highlights thus far. So first, I wondered if measures of dam behavior taken pre-pregnancy might predict the type of mother she would become, because as you might imagine, that could be really useful information to know. And so it seems like the answer is yes, at least to some extent. Our strongest finding here was that dams who were wary of some novel objects, so in other words, they took a long time to approach them, they didn't spend a lot of time in proximity to them, they showed higher levels of maternal behavior at all 3 weeks post-whelp. I found this novel object finding pretty interesting because I think it's a behavioral finding that potentially is going hand in hand with one of our findings from the CNI study. So the most motherly dogs at the CNI showed the highest baseline levels of CORT, as well as the biggest increase in cortisol levels following that small stressor. So it seems consistent here that we're again seeing dogs that behaviorally are appearing a little stressed and wary of the cats are similarly going on to show the highest levels of mothering behavior. Next big question, can mothering style help us predict who will be best suited for becoming a service dog? And lo and behold, we did again find a strong association between maternal style and outcome. So here I'm showing the maternal style scores at the second week post-birth, and it's separated by puppies that went on to graduate on the left versus puppies that were released from the program on the right. And a clear relationship emerges. So graduate dogs experienced higher levels of maternal behavior than released dogs. So if you're paying attention, you'll notice that this appears to actually be the opposite of what we saw with the CNI results. But I think it actually makes sense considering the different phenotypes that we're hoping for from these two populations. So in other words, maternal style is likely having a similar impact on behavior in both cases. It's perhaps just that lower levels of maternal style likely foster traits that are important to guide work, so things like independence, whereas higher levels of maternal style likely foster traits that are important to service work, so things like interest in humans. So in conclusion, maternal behavior over the puppy's first few weeks of life has important implications for later puppy behavior and outcome, but those implications are nuanced. There doesn't appear to be a one-size-fits-all mothering style that's universally best. Rather, it really depends on what the goals are for the puppy later in life. And finally, this knowledge is hopefully really important for canine companions as they consider which dogs to select as breeders. So it's not just about the genes that they pass on, but also the early environment that they provide. So now we're going to turn to some of our puppy behavioral data that we collected when puppies are around 8 to 9 weeks of age. And so here we were wondering, what are dogs capable of, even as young puppies? And how early do we see evidence for the sorts of skills that we know adult dogs can be really great at? And I just want to point out that in the past, researchers have done a lot of work on temperament testing with puppies. This is also informative, also something that we do. But there hasn't traditionally been a lot of exploration into their cognition. So first, we wanted to see how early certain cognitive skills start to emerge. So importantly, these dogs are all born in California, and they pass through the Canine Early Development Center before they're sent out to puppy raisers all over the country. And this presents an opportunity to evaluate the puppies when they are about 8 to 9 weeks old. And then all dogs do return to campus to enter professional training when they hit around 18 months of age. And so then again, they're able to be evaluated. So in the work I'm about to describe, my colleagues and I tested 168 retriever puppies. They spent their first 6 weeks with their mothers and their litter mates, and then after weaning up until the time of testing, they continued to live with their litter mates. And so it wasn't until after testing that the puppies went on to live with their volunteer puppy raisers, and that's when they really start forming that one-to-one bond with their human companion. So since 2011, we've been conducting behavioral tests that use a battery of many different tasks. And we intentionally cast a broad net when we designed these tasks. So we wanted to capture general skills in dogs that we hypothesized might be important across the board. So things like impulse control, memory, as well as skills that are likely useful in working dog roles. So for example, sensory discrimination tasks and gestural communication might be really important in the life of a detection dog, whereas independent problem-solving tasks are directed at what we think might be important for guide dogs, and then things like orienting towards humans and interpreting our social cues might be important in service dogs. And the best part is that not only do all of these tasks allow us a window into how dogs think, but the dogs genuinely enjoy participating.
Puppy, look!
Video evidence.
Okay. Come on! Puppy, look! Puppy, look! Okay! Oh! Puppy, look!
All right, so as I mentioned, not a lot of work has looked at the implications of cognitive traits in working dogs, and especially not in puppies. However, research that I helped conduct as an undergraduate and that Dr. McLean led, looked at canine companions' adult dogs when they were in training and started to reveal the importance of social cognition specifically. So we found that social measures like gazing to a human in these various contexts were linked to ultimate success as a service dog. So I'm now going to highlight the tasks that measure social cognition early in development. And specifically, we presented these 168 puppies with 2 tasks that assessed each dog's ability to comprehend communicative gestures. I'm going to show you some videos again. So the first task involved getting the dog's attention and then placing a yellow block that the dog had never seen before next to the correct cup.
Look! Puppy, look! Puppy, look! Okay!
And then in our second task, it was a pointing task. And so here we're conveying information socially to the puppy by pointing to the correct cup. Should be very familiar to us as humans. My 1-year-old does this all the time now.
Puppy, look! Okay!
All right, and then additionally, we had 2 tasks that assessed each dog's tendency to reciprocate or initiate a social interaction. And in these cases, we were interested in their gazing behavior. So first, we have our human interest task, where we measured the puppy's motivation to attend to a human who spoke to the puppy using dog-directed speech.
Hi, Pup. Are you a good puppy?
Can you guys hear this? Oh, wait, I'm muted. No, wait.
Oh, look how cute you are.
Anyway, it's like, hi, pup. Are you a good puppy? Yes, you are. You're a good puppy, etc. And then in our unsolvable task, 4 30-second trials occur where food is locked in a container, and we measure how much eye contact the puppies make with the experimenter, as well as how much time they independently manipulate the container. This is like a really cute example of eye contact. Like literally puppy dog eyes. All right, so back to our question, how early do social skills emerge, both in terms of comprehension and initiation, and what does this look like over time? So we started by looking at whether dogs could comprehend and use the social information during our marker and pointing tasks. So the y-axis is the percent of trials that the dogs chose correctly on average, and if the dogs did not understand the task, we'd expect to see performance at chance levels, or 50%, which would basically mean they're guessing. So even at just 9 weeks of age, before living one-on-one with a human companion, we found that puppies were able to follow both the marker and pointing cues significantly above chance. And so their performance is indicated here by the blue bars. Now I'm showing you their adult scores, indicated by the yellow bars. So on these same social cues, as adults, dogs were above chance as well, as we would expect. but they were also significantly better than they had been as puppies. So this suggests that these sorts of cognitive skills are present early on, and they are still improving over development. We also included an important control. After all, these are dogs. How do we know that they aren't just using their noses? This is like the #1 question we get. But we can very confidently say that smelling out the treat did not account for their good scores, because when we give them the exact same task, but just take away all communicative cues, both puppies and adults are just a chance, and they only find the food on 50% of the trials. And then you'll remember we had those 2 tasks where we measured their sort of production of social behavior, quantified as the time spent looking to the human. So we again found social tendencies are present in puppies. Again, those are those blue lines, but they definitely strengthen over time, right? We see a lot more looking when they are adults. We also see, though, that puppies look longer when speech is being directed toward them, as in our human interest task, than when they are in this potential help-seeking situation, as in our unsolvable task. So, what factors are contributing to these skills, and particularly what might explain individual differences in puppies' abilities? So we saw that social skills can generally show up early in dogs without very much experience and with no training, but is there a genetic basis for them? So oh shoot, sorry, it's cut off a little bit. Anyway, to get at the genetic piece, we calculated heritability, which is the amount of variation in a given trait that can be accounted for by genetic factors. And so heritability estimates can range from 0 to 1, where 0 means none of the variance can be attributed to genetics, it's all environmental, while 1 would mean that genetics is responsible for all of the variance. And we can estimate heritability by following traits through families. And importantly, if a desirable trait is highly heritable, that means it makes sense to potentially try to breed for it. Alternatively, if a desirable trait is not highly heritable, don't despair. It just means that it makes more sense to try to foster it environmentally or screen for it. So we estimated the heritability for each cognitive trait using Bayesian linear mixed models that incorporated a relatedness matrix for the study population. So crucially, to do so, you need to know the pedigree of the dogs that you tested. And because canine companions has been breeding their own population for over 30 years, we had that information. So I used that original data set of the 168 8 to 10-week-old puppies that I presented earlier, along with 207 more puppies from the same population that we subsequently tested on all of the same tasks as part of our maternal style study. So all told, our heritability analyses included over 3 years worth of data from 375 puppies. And so here, I'm showing the heritability estimates for our social tasks. And as it turns out, both for pointing and looking time during human interest, over 40% of the variation can be explained by genetic factors. And just to put this into perspective, milk yield in cattle has a heritability of about 20 to 30%, and pen hip scores, so kind of like a measure of hip laxity in this population, has a heritability of around 50 to 60%. So we found these results really exciting because they're basically providing the first direct evidence that communicative cue following, which is a real cornerstone for human-animal interaction, is under genetic control. And so that not only has implications for how this trait came to be, but also how we can impact it in the future. So for example, by breeding for it. Importantly, there was also no evidence that puppies were learning over the course of the task. We know this because their performance didn't improve as a function of trial number, and the participants were significantly above chance in using the communicative gestures to find the food, even from the very first trial. And finally, in a complementary study, we were able to compare dog puppies to wolf puppies on tasks of both social and non-social cognition, and found differences only in the social realm. So all of these findings taken together point to dogs' communicative abilities as a trait that has likely been selected for over the course of domestication. All right, so we know there is some underlying genetic basis due to the influence of familiar relations on the trait and our heritability. However, heritability analyses cannot tell us anything about which specific genes are involved. So we are currently like as we speak, in the process of diving deeper into this through what is called a GWAS, or a genome-wide association study. So essentially that just means that we are determining and then comparing the genome sequences for all of these dogs, over 1,000, and assessing whether we can identify specific genetic markers that are associated with the cognitive and behavioral traits that we're studying. So stay tuned on that piece. All right, so next I'm going to turn to our research using the in-house standardized evaluations that Canine Companions has been collecting for almost 20 years, which is super exciting. So specifically, we can look at puppy raiser answers to a behavioral questionnaire that's administered when the dogs are 1 year old, as well as behavioral ratings that are assigned to dogs when they turn in for professional training. And this usually takes place when they're about 18 to 22 months of age, based on, and it's based on how they react to and recover from a set of standardized events. They call it the INFOR test. So from an applied perspective, it would be super valuable, obviously, if we could identify characteristics of the most and least successful dogs. And this is a really important question, both because these dogs can cost the organization over $50,000 each, and because the waiting lists can sometimes extend to over a year long. So being able to predict which dogs are most and least likely to graduate can therefore save resources and point us to which characteristics are important to cultivate and breed for moving forward, like we were talking about earlier. So we did some predictive modeling using scores from the CBARC, which is this behavioral questionnaire that asks about ways in which dogs typically respond to common events, situations, stimuli in their environment. And it takes the puppy raisers about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. So relatively low effort. And then we were able to look at almost 3,000 dogs whose puppy raisers had filled out this questionnaire when they were 12 months old. And then we could predict whether or not the dog would go on to become a service dog. So just to orient you, and in this data, we did know, like we already knew if they became a service dog or not. So just to orient you, the red dotted line here represents the no information rate. So this is the percent of time that we would be correct if for every dog we predicted the same most likely outcome. So in this particular sample of dogs, 60% of them were released. So if we just guess release for every dog, 60% of the time we would be right. Therefore, if we can predict with higher than 60% accuracy, that's when it starts becoming helpful. So across the bottom, you can see that the predicted data is divided into 10 groups or deciles. And the model assigns a predicted probability of success to every dog. And so the dogs in the bottom 10% were predicted to do the worst in the program, and dogs in the top 10% were predicted to do the best. And what we're seeing on the y-axis is the actual accuracy of the model's predictions. So for example, the predictions that we, or the model, made about the bottom 10% of dogs were correct over 90% of the time. So clearly, we were best at predicting the dogs who would eventually get dropped from the program. And since the CBARC is mainly asking about and quantifying problematic behaviors, this makes sense. So it'll be interesting in the future to potentially try to incorporate some of our cognitive assessments, and hopefully those will be valuable in making more accurate predictions on the other end of the spectrum as well. Interestingly, while the model uses scores on all the variables in the CBARC, and it's 101 items, to generate these predictions, it's possible to ask which specific variables are sort of most important in building that prediction. And so I've listed the top 3 variables from the CBARC here. So unsurprisingly, aggression, barking, and chewing were all associated with a lower probability of graduation. So to me, one of the most interesting takeaways here is that inappropriate barking, as observed and reported by the puppy raiser, was strongly predictive of release from the Canine Companions program. And I think that's interesting because a similar result has also independently been reported in 2 different populations of guide dogs, one of which was the seeing eye in my dissertation. But in both cases, barking within an experimental context was measured and then found to be associated with release. Okay, so the final question we were interested in was about the developmental trajectory that skills follow over adolescence and into young adulthood. So in other words, to what extent does puppy behavior predict adult behavior? And to answer this question, we're going to turn back to our dog cognitive development battery data. So this is an exciting stage in our research because we get to see dogs back again who we studied as young puppies. And that means that we know something about their early experiences and their early characteristics. And we can ask questions about the extent to which cognitive and behavioral traits have either stayed the same or changed during their development into young adulthood. And the main way that we asked this initially was to conduct one-to-one comparisons between performance as a puppy and as an adult on the exact same task. And so we can just use the traditional approach of Spearman's correlations to look at rank order stability. So here, these are all of our tasks. Circles indicate their rank order correlation coefficient, and black circles indicate significant correlations. So the first thing to note is that for 17 of the tasks, the correlation coefficients were positive, and only 6 are negative. And then 5 individual traits had significant rank order correlations, all of which were positive. So here's a closer look at those traits with significant longitudinal stability. So for example, if we look at that first graph on the top left, and you split the puppies into 2 groups, so those who looked the most versus those who looked the least as puppies during the human interest task, you can see that as adults, those who looked the most as puppies are still looking to the human at higher levels than those who had looked the least as puppies. And that same pattern sort of plays out in those who followed the marker cue most faithfully, those who independently manipulated the box the most during our unsolvable task, those who are most accurate in discriminating odor, and those who perform best on our cylinder task reversal trials, which is sort of a measure of cognitive flexibility. We also recently looked at some of our temperament tasks in addition to the cognitive ones. And we were basically interested in gauging how dogs react when they're confronted with an unusual situation. So after all, out in the real world, these sorts of scenarios are unavoidable for working dogs. And how that dog responds is both extremely important and has tangible safety implications. So allow me to introduce you to for real friend Daisy ×2. So these are motion-activated cats that purr, they meow, they sing a little song if you squeeze their paw twice. I just learned that yesterday. And they make unpredictable movements. And so before you totally write them off, I want you to know that these fuzzy mechanical toys are actually quite useful gauges of future guide dog behavior. So my past research found that a dog's ultimate success as a guide dog could be predicted in part by how the dogs reacted to meeting these little guys for the first time. This is where the barking came in. And so I'm now going to show you videos of 2 different canine companions dogs, each at 2 different time points. And so this is getting into our longitudinal data. So first we'll see them at 8 weeks. This is our first puppy. Be a little wary. A little kink in it still. Yes, but then decides maybe not so much. So this is that same exact dog, same exact testing room. 18 months later, now there's 2 cats. And we're gonna see a pretty, like, honestly, eerily similar scene play out. Same tail. You know it's the same dog. And still not loving the cats. So here's a different dog, at the other end of the spectrum. This is definitely a older, more curious puppy in this scenario, at least. Very playful. We're going to speed it up for you here. Loving the cats, or cat. Then we're going to fast forward 18 months again. And once again, it's like the same scenario. Happy, tail wagging, playful, loves the cats. So the videos do seem to suggest that puppy behavior is related to adult behavior, but does this hold true across our data set more broadly? So just to quickly orient you, the y-axis will be the adult boldness score. So here, higher values indicate more bold responses. And then the x-axis is broken down so that the shyest puppies are represented on the left and the boldest puppies on the right. And indeed, we do see this pretty strong association. So shy puppies seem to remain shy adults and vice versa for the bold puppies. And so perhaps an even more interesting question, is this meaningful in the context of working dog outcome? Does the adult boldness score relate to training outcome? And again, we see this really interesting association. So dogs who ultimately graduate from Canine Companions program score much higher in boldness than the dogs who are ultimately released from the program. Okay, so given that it's stable over time and predictive of success, the next big question is it heritable? And in fact, it is. So genetics explain about 30% of the variance in this trait. So this one turns out to be a potentially really great trait to target for the breeding program. Again, it's linked to success in the program, and it has enough of a genetic component that we can make some real progress breeding dogs based on how they score on this test, potentially. And moving forward, we're going to be doing these sorts of analyses for every trait that we've measured. And hopefully that's going to prove invaluable as we figure out where and how we can really make the most impact. So at its core, all of the research that I've described today is about observing and understanding dog behavior. And that is really crucial in facilitating our positive interactions with them. As we know, dogs can't verbalize, well, other than the barking. So their behavior is how they communicate with us. And so how we interpret that behavior, as well as understanding more about why they're displaying that behavior in the first place and what factors might be affecting it, that is going to lead to more responsible practices in everything from our day-to-day interactions with them, to our breeding decisions, to our working dog placements. And one of the things that makes this research unique is that it's useful both for asking and answering these general questions that apply to cognition broadly, as well as we've talked about, digging into applied issues related to human-animal interaction, and especially in the working dog field. So we've published a review that summarizes how we can continue to use research to most effectively and efficiently provide working dogs moving forward. Here's the main figure from this paper. Don't worry, you don't have to read everything. But essentially here we're listing traits that researchers have looked at in the past and found to be associated with working dog outcomes. So in this darkest circle in the middle, it's a handful of traits that are probably really important for any working dog, regardless of their specific job. So this is things like confidence and lack of fear, trainability, or a lack of body sensitivity. However, I also like this figure because as I start to fill it in for you, you'll see it emphasizes that different roles rely on different behaviors. And in fact, some traits that might be a deal breaker in one role are actually an asset in a different role. So one specific example is that hyperactivity, really problematic in an assistance dog, grounds for release potentially, but it's actually seen as a positive in a detection and protection dog. Interestingly, even among subcategories of assistance dogs, so guide dogs compared to service dogs, there are differences. And this likely reflects differences in the tasks they must perform, but also gaps in the literature. Maybe we just haven't looked yet. And so this brings me to my point that this list is very much a work in progress. It's just a starting point, and so many people, myself included, are still trying to figure out what makes some dogs more successful over others across all the different career paths. So I always like to end my talks about our behavioral work with a huge shout out to all of the students and research assistants who have helped over the years, ranging from high school and undergraduate through graduate and veterinary school. We really could not do any of this without all of them, so thank you. Many of them are in the room today. And I also want to acknowledge my lab members and teammates who are true partners in this research, and of course our funding sources who have graciously supported and also made this research possible over the years. And of course, thank you all for listening, and I'm more than happy to take questions. Yeah, we have time. Oh, there's a hand raised. Allison? Or am I supposed to call on people?
Yeah, Allison can unmute and ask her question.
Hi, Dr. Bray. Your talk was incredibly interesting.
Wait, sorry. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear. Do you want me to just? Okay, yes.
Okay. So I was just wondering, I had two questions going back to the maternal research. I was wondering if it had been noted in the dams how many litters they had had and how old they are, and when the corresponding to having those litters in response to how interactive they were with their puppies.
Yes. Okay. So her first question is back to the maternal style research, asking about the parity of the dams. So if they'd had puppies before, and that is an excellent, and the age of the dam, which that is basically, what's the word when they're totally confounded with the number of puppies? Because basically the way that the working dog organizations work, the moms are having puppies at similar ages. Yeah. So we did look at parity. That's definitely an important feature. Interestingly, so in the Seeing Eye study, we found that parity did have an effect. What is it? I think the first-time moms were more motherly than the later ones. Interestingly, in the canine companions data, we did not see that effect. Not exactly sure why. The other thing that is important, and that especially in the Seeing Eye data, because the Seeing Eye data included German Shepherds, is breed of the dam. So I think that is definitely something, or I know that's something that also impacts maternal behavior for sure. And what was your second question?
I appreciate that. I meant to add on the breed too, of comparing like Goldens to Goldens and Shepherds to Shepherds, because we all know, they have their own inherent traits. And then my next question was, so I'm a little bit familiar with some of how the other schools work, in the sense of breeders are chosen after successful completion of their post-puppy raiser training. Is that also the same for canine companions and the eye school that you looked at, or the guide
Seeing
dog?
Eye. Yeah, so her second question was about when in their path are the breeders chosen. And right, that definitely does vary by school. So at Canine Companions, they basically do breeder selection once the dogs have gone through about 3 months of training. So they don't complete the entire amount of training, but they do start training and make, the trainers sort of have eyes on them and make sure that there aren't any like behaviors cropping up that might be an issue. Yes, and then the Seeing Eye, that is a good question. I can't remember. I'm so sorry. I can look it up. I have a book about them. I'll look it up and let you know. Theodora, I know you.
Amazing talk, Emily. Thank you so much.
That was
I
amazing.
had a question. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Oh, she's coming out of down here. Okay, I can hear you.
Okay. Well, first, amazing talk. Thank you. I had a question about, do you think there's a potential conflict with some traits that might help dams have a higher maternal investment versus a dog that might be a successful service dog, between because what you were talking about with a more fearful response to the novel object might show higher maternal style for a dam, versus bolder responses to novel object will have higher success for service dog. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that more.
She had a really interesting question. Okay, so she was saying, do you think there's a potential like conflict in what you're looking for in a dam versus a service dog? And so, for example, and this is a really good point, we said, oh, look, the bolder, and specifically too in the interactions with the cat, right? They go on to be successful service dogs. And then actually what we're seeing in the like desirable dams is that they're kind of wary of the cats, which is an interesting point. I know that I feel like we've talked about this, Theodora, where, and I think some, like maybe Guide Dogs does this, where there's a potential that in your breeding program, you could breed for service dogs, and then you could also breed for breeders, or like, and that would almost be two separate but complementary aims. And that's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating because it's also heritable. So yeah, I'll have to think, you're hurting my brain a little bit, but that's really interesting and potentially useful, right? And sort of like to the point of when I showed that graph at the end, and it's like, oh, different dogs or different traits excel in different roles. And I think honestly, like working dog organizations in general do a really great job of kind of capitalizing on that. So for example, if Canine Companions, a dog is released, the first thing they do is look to see if they would be successful in a different working dog role, like perhaps like a bomb detection role where it is like too much energy for what's needed for a service dog. But just the right amount for that line of work. So I feel like that might seem random, but kind of ties into this idea of like, as we learn more about the dogs and what's good in what role, we can better fully utilize and place them in where they're going to be happiest and most successful. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Emily.
Yes. Carrie?
I need to repeat my question for that.
Oh, yeah.
What about the sires?
What about them?
Put in any data
Oh.
rules on them? Or
Oh,
are
like-
they just completely like, they're just a genetic.
Right. No, that's so she asked, what about the sires? Like, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question. We definitely account for them in the genetics, right? But I would say for the most part, they, with exceptions, right, they never meet their puppies. So it's really mostly their genetic contribution. I mean, there's like a few exceptions I can think of in like puppy raising scenarios, or like the picture I showed earlier of Big Bear, Little Bear, their father, son, and the son grew up with the dad. So like in that case, but the vast majority of cases, the system is just such that they don't routinely interact, at least. But good question. There's more to the equation. Noah.
With regards to like the social phenotypes, it looks like generally for the service dogs, you want the dogs to have really high social interest. Does like, or I guess not specifically with social phenotype, but do we see like if the dogs have higher social interest that they perform worse on other tasks that we would want them to be good at?
So he asked, generally it seems like we want the service dogs at least to have a social phenotype, but do we see any sort of inverse correlations between social phenotype and other things that we may or may not want them to be good at? And I think the answer is we don't really, because I mean, that's like the first thing we did when we created this massive battery with all these tasks, and we're like, oh, we'll do like a principal component analysis where we kind of summarize and see how things load together, and like nothing did. So I guess we did a really good job of casting a very broad, diverse net. But so that makes me think, though, then like to your question, then it's like they're just unrelated, like in a standardized way at least. But it is a good question, and maybe there's other ways to think about it. But yeah. Are there questions in the chat, or are people just...
No, we won't.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you.
It's praise for your talk.
Thanks, guys.
I think I asked you this. I think it's everyone might be interested in it. Has Canine Companions or any other or ADI organizations changed their policies and procedures because of this data, or not yet? Or do you think they will?
So oh, interesting. I thought you were actually going somewhere else with that question. So her question was, has Canine Companions or any other ADI organizations changed their policies or procedures like as a direct result of this data, or do I think they will? So I thought you were going to ask if they had changed their procedures over the course of collecting this data, which they have, which is sort of an interesting extra thing. But so to that question, I think yes, in that we have started helping with estimated breeding values and like basically the breeder selection process. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily using the maternal style piece regularly, but definitely in terms of trying to kind of like very like statistically and rigorously pull in all the data that we have on the dogs and like make an informed decision. Not that it's going to be like cut and dry, it's a little bit of an art and a science. But yeah, and then I'm trying to think, I mean, I think our hope and what we've sort of been moving towards, so as I said, and showed you, there were like all these different tasks. And over the years, we've actually been sort of whittling them down, because even if it's like, oh, we do this giant battery and we find so much predictive power, it's like, well, then you need to implement that battery. But if we could have like an abbreviated version, similar to kind of like, with the dog aging battery as well, then it can be way more useful and scalable. And so that's definitely something that we're moving towards, where like, maybe there's a world where, one day we test all the puppies. And again, not to necessarily release them at that age, but just know like, oh, they might need more help in this, or this is the best way to support them to get them to the best outcome. So like yes and no, and I think we're hopeful that more will be coming. Yeah.
Sort of like Carrie made me think about, so we're talking about like what could we do if maybe some traits aren't like totally heritable, or maybe we can help foster some of them. Has there ever been maybe like consider like during maternal styles, that's really like specific dam puppy, like that interaction, like if there's a litter of puppies who aren't getting as much attention, can a person step in and sort of supplement that nurture component?
Yeah, that's super interesting. So her question was about, like, especially in the maternal style, because we had talked about how can we foster, we know this is a good thing, how can we foster that? And so if like, we know that maternal style is a good thing, and then we see that a dog is not giving a lot of maternal style, could a human sort of like step in and not be a surrogate mother, but like give extra whatever it is? I think that's a super interesting question. I feel like we still need to know more about the mechanism of like why the maternal style or how the maternal style is working. But I mean, that's sort of similar to the rodent literature, right? Like the handling and the, yeah. And then there's always the question of like cross fostering, which, can happen if it's like a dam doesn't have enough milk, but like, what if she doesn't have enough social energy, like, right? So I think that's fascinating. We've not done it, but I think that would be complicated, but also worth thinking about for sure. I also wonder too, sorry, you got me talking about maternal style. Right, we measure the maternal style, but also, the breeder caretakers or the CEDC techs are very involved, right? Like it's not like the humans aren't there, they're there every day too. And so it is interesting that maybe maybe it's the case that the dogs that aren't getting a lot of maternal style are actually now getting a lot of human interaction, and like that's what's driving, you know what I mean? So again, that's what I mean why we found these correlations, but the mechanism piece we don't know yet. Yeah.
Maybe think about the caretaker too. Like, are some a little more like, I mean, I can imagine being there and
right,
using your mind over puppies all the time, but
well, yeah, and I mean, even so, like in the breeder caretaker homes, some have them in different places of their house that have like more or less foot traffic even. So even just that, if it's like the laundry room versus the kitchen. Yeah, we weren't able to really look at that level of detail with that sample size. Oh, Brenda, sorry. Oh my God, am I misrepresenting? What did she say? Can I look at it? Yeah.
Yeah, all right, read it.
Oh, cool. Should I read it? Oh, you can read it now. Oh, cool. Yay. So they are listening to my work. No. Thank you, Brenda. No.
If someone was trying to like breed dogs to be service dogs or trying to select a dog to be a service dog, what would be the most important things for them? Like if you're not a huge organization, but if you're an individual, what kind of things would you do in selecting the right dog? Like as a breeder and the puppy?
Selecting one or breeding one? Both. Well, that's what we're trying to answer. But I do think that what seems to keep coming out, and like, we're still diving into all of this data, but I do feel like for service dogs, the social piece is really important. This like making eye contact. So that's something that you could look for or try to breed for. But yeah, I think it's a good question. Like, what's the practical implementation of this stuff? Eye contact. No barking. Less barking. Cool. I see it's 11:59. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining online. Are you doing the recording? Did you record it? Awesome.
And this software recording, and then I get
Oh yeah, if you press
cloud and like edit it.
Oh, it's sweet. Yeah. Oh, and this stuff.